At 23, my son Marcus looked me straight in the eye and said, "Dad, you're embarrassing me. Stop showing up to things." He was referring to his college graduation ceremony, where I had cheered too loudly when they called his name. But 6 months later, when the federal investigation began and he desperately needed character references, my phone rang 47 times in one night. By then, it was too late for apologies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the windows of my modest apartment in Portland, Oregon, creating a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. I stared at the letter in my hands, reading it for the fifth time, trying to make sense of words that seemed impossible. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Criminal Investigation Division. Your son, Marcus Theodore Brennan. The paper trembled between my fingers as reality crashed over me like ice water. My name is Theodore Brennan, but everyone calls me Theo. I'm 52 years old, and for the past 30 years, I've worked as a maintenance supervisor at Lincoln Elementary School. Not glamorous work, but honest work. Work that kept the lights on and the heat running while single-handedly raising Marcus after his mother walked out when he was 7. Work that paid for his private school tuition, his college expenses, and his law school dreams. Work that apparently meant nothing to him. The letter explained that Marcus was under federal investigation for embezzlement and fraud at the prestigious law firm where he'd been working since graduation. Peterson, Martinez and Associates, the kind of white shoe firm that represented Fortune 500 companies and charged $500 an hour for junior associates to research case law. Marcus had landed the job through connections made during his internship, connections I'd helped him secure by working overtime to pay for his expensive networking events and professional wardrobe. I remembered the day he got that job offer, March 15th, just 3 months after graduation. He'd called me from his downtown apartment, the one I'd co-signed for because his credit wasn't established yet. His voice was electric with excitement, describing the corner office they'd promised him, the partnership track he'd be on, the salary that would finally make all our sacrifices worthwhile. For the first time in years, Marcus had sounded genuinely happy to share good news with me. But that happiness had been short-lived. Within weeks of starting at Peterson, Martinez and Associates, Marcus began treating me like an inconvenience. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. When I suggested celebrating his first month at the firm with dinner, he told me he was too busy networking with more important people. When I asked about visiting his new office, he said the firm discouraged personal visitors during business hours. The distance between us had grown slowly, so gradually that I'd convinced myself it was natural. Young professionals needed space to establish themselves. Marcus was building his career, making connections, proving himself worthy of the opportunities I'd sacrificed to provide. I told myself that his embarrassment about my blue-collar background was temporary, something he'd outgrow once his confidence grew. The graduation ceremony incident had been the breaking point. Lincoln High School's auditorium was packed with families celebrating their children's achievements. I'd taken the day off work, something I rarely did, and driven 2 hours to attend Marcus's law school graduation. I'd worn my best suit, the navy one I'd bought for job interviews 15 years earlier, and arrived early to get a good seat near the front. When they called Marcus's name, something inside me exploded with pride. This was it, the moment that validated every overtime shift, every missed meal, every sacrifice I'd made since Sarah left us. My son, the first person in our family to graduate from college, let alone law school, was walking across that stage to receive his Juris Doctor degree. I stood up and cheered, probably louder than appropriate, clapping until my hands hurt. Marcus's face when he spotted me in the crowd was pure mortification. Not the grateful smile I'd expected, not the acknowledgement of everything we'd accomplished together, but raw embarrassment. After the ceremony, while other families took photos and celebrated together, Marcus pulled me aside behind the building where no one could see us. "Dad, you're embarrassing me," he said, his voice sharp with frustration. "This isn't some high school football game. These are serious people, future colleagues, potential mentors. I need them to take me seriously." I looked around at the other families, professors in academic robes chatting with proud parents, graduates posing for pictures with siblings and grandparents. Everyone seemed relaxed and celebratory. I couldn't understand what I'd done wrong. "I was just proud of you, son," I said quietly. "This is a big day for both of us." "For you, maybe," Marcus replied coldly. "But this is my career we're talking about. I can't have you showing up to things and making a scene. These people need to see me as a professional, not as some janitor's kid who doesn't know how to behave in polite society." The words hit me like physical blows. Janitor's kid. As if my work maintaining the school where hundreds of children learned and grew every day was something shameful. As if the calloused hands that had provided for him his entire life were a source of embarrassment rather than pride. "I understand," I said, though I didn't understand at all. "I'll be more careful in the future." "Actually," Marcus continued, adjusting his graduation cap, "I think it's better if you don't come to things anymore, at least not work-related events. I'll let you know when it's appropriate." I drove home in silence that day, the 2-hour journey giving me plenty of time to replay his words. The navy suit felt uncomfortable now, like a costume I'd worn to a party where I didn't belong. At red lights, I caught glimpses of my reflection in the rearview mirror and saw what Marcus saw: a middle-aged man with permanent grease under his fingernails and a face weathered by years of physical labor. A man who didn't fit into the polished world his son was entering. The months that followed were filled with careful distance. I learned to navigate conversations with Marcus like walking through a minefield, always aware that the wrong word or reference to my work might set off his embarrassment. When he mentioned office parties or firm events, I made sure not to ask if I could attend. When he talked about his colleagues, I listened without offering opinions or advice that might reveal my working-class perspective. Our relationship became a performance where I played the role of a supportive but invisible father, present enough to provide emotional support when needed, but invisible enough not to damage his professional image. I told myself this was temporary, that once Marcus established himself at the firm, once his confidence grew and his position solidified, he'd remember that family mattered more than appearances. I was wrong. The first sign of serious trouble came in a phone call 3 months after graduation. Marcus's voice was different, strained in a way I'd never heard before. He was calling from his apartment on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual since he typically worked late during the week. "Dad, I need to ask you something," he said, his words careful and measured. "If anyone calls asking about me, about my character or my background, just tell them you're proud of me and that I've always been honest. Keep it simple." The request seemed odd, but I agreed without question. At the time, I assumed it had something to do with a background check for a security clearance, or perhaps a more thorough vetting for a promotion. Law firms dealt with sensitive information, and it made sense that they'd want to verify their employees' integrity. "Of course, son," I said. "Is everything all right at work?" "Everything's fine," he replied quickly. "Just routine stuff. I have to go, but thanks, Dad. I appreciate it." The call lasted less than 3 minutes, but something about Marcus's tone lingered with me for days. There was an undercurrent of anxiety, a tension that suggested routine wasn't quite accurate. But I pushed my concerns aside, trusting that my son would share details when he was ready. 2 weeks later, the phone call I'd been warned about came. Special Agent Jennifer Rodriguez from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division introduced herself with professional courtesy and explained that she was conducting a background investigation related to Marcus Brennan. The conversation was brief and seemed standard, covering Marcus's character, his honesty, and my observations of his behavior over the years. I told the truth. Marcus had never been in serious trouble as a child. He'd worked hard in school, earned good grades, and shown ambition from an early age. He'd never stolen anything, never lied about anything significant, and had always seemed driven to succeed through legitimate means. Agent Rodriguez thanked me for my time and ended the call without providing details about the investigation's nature. I called Marcus immediately after speaking with the FBI agent, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message letting him know about the call and asking him to call me back when he had a chance. Days passed without a response. My subsequent calls also went unanswered, and my text messages received no replies. The silence stretched into weeks. I began checking local news websites, searching for any mention of Peterson Martinez and Associates or federal investigations involving law firms. I found nothing, which only increased my anxiety. Whatever was happening with Marcus, it was serious enough to involve the FBI, but not yet public enough to attract media attention. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling of my small bedroom, replaying every conversation I'd had with Marcus over the past year. Had there been signs I'd missed? Had his embarrassment about my background driven him to do something desperate to fit into his new world? Had my blue-collar values failed to instill the kind of integrity that would protect him from temptation? The questions tormented me because I had no answers. The son I'd raised, the boy who'd helped me repair broken playground equipment and paint classroom walls during summer breaks, seemed like a stranger now. The successful lawyer who was too embarrassed to be seen with his father was facing federal charges, and I had no idea how we'd reached this point. Work became my refuge during those uncertain weeks. The familiar routine of checking heating systems, replacing burnt-out light bulbs, and maintaining the playground equipment provided structure and purpose when everything else felt chaotic. The children at Lincoln Elementary knew me as Mr. Theo, the friendly maintenance man who fixed their broken swings and made sure their classrooms stayed warm in winter. They didn't care about my education level or my social status. They simply appreciated that I made their school a better place to learn and grow. Mrs. Patterson, the principal, noticed my distraction during our weekly maintenance meetings. She was a kind woman in her 60s who'd worked in education for over 30 years and had a talent for reading people's emotional states. "Theo, you seem worried about something," she said during our meeting in late April. "Is everything all right at home?" I considered sharing my concerns about Marcus, but I didn't want to burden her with my personal problems. "Just some family stuff," I said. "Nothing that affects my work here." "Family stuff often affects everything," she replied gently. "If you need to talk, my door is always open. And if you need time off to handle anything, just let me know." Her offer of support meant more than she probably realized. In my world of careful distance from Marcus and his professional embarrassment, Mrs. Patterson's straightforward kindness reminded me that some relationships were built on mutual respect rather than social climbing. The official notification came on a gray Thursday morning in May. The letter from the FBI arrived in my mailbox along with utility bills and grocery store advertisements, its official seal and formal language transforming an ordinary day into a nightmare. The charges against Marcus were extensive: embezzlement of client funds, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The amounts involved were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from client accounts over the course of several months. According to the letter, Marcus had been systematically transferring money from client trust accounts into personal accounts he'd established under false names. The scheme had been sophisticated, involving multiple banks and carefully timed transactions designed to avoid detection. He'd used his position as a junior associate to access client account information and his knowledge of the firm's financial systems to cover his tracks. The investigation had been triggered by a routine audit that discovered discrepancies in client account balances. Once the FBI began following the money trail, Marcus's involvement became clear quickly. The evidence was overwhelming, according to the letter, including bank records, email communications, and documented access to the affected accounts. I read the charges 3 times before the reality settled in. My son, the boy I'd raised to value honesty and hard work, had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who'd trusted him with their money. The professional career he'd been so desperate to protect had been built on criminal activity. The embarrassment he'd felt about my blue-collar background paled in comparison to the shame he'd brought on himself through his choices. The letter also mentioned that Marcus's legal team had requested character references as part of their defense strategy. They were apparently planning to argue that his criminal behavior was an aberration, a momentary lapse in judgment that didn't reflect his true character. They wanted people who'd known him throughout his life to testify about his honesty, integrity, and moral foundation. I set the letter down on my kitchen table and stared out the window at the apartment complex's small courtyard. Children were playing on the swing set, their laughter carrying through the thin walls. Their innocence and joy stood in stark contrast to the corruption detailed in the federal documents spread before me. Somewhere in downtown Portland, Marcus was probably meeting with expensive lawyers, trying to construct a defense that would minimize his prison sentence. The irony wasn't lost on me. The son who'd found me too embarrassing to acknowledge publicly now needed me to vouch for his character in federal court. The father, whose working-class background had been a source of shame, was being asked to provide testimony that might influence his sentencing. The man he distanced himself from was suddenly valuable as a character witness. My phone rang as I was still processing the letter's contents. Marcus's name appeared on the caller ID, the first time he'd contacted me in over 2 months. I stared at the screen for several rings before answering, unsure what to say to someone who'd just been exposed as a federal criminal. "Dad?" Marcus's voice was barely recognizable, hoarse and desperate. "Did you get a letter from the FBI?" "I did," I said quietly. "I'm reading it now." "Look, I can explain everything," he said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "It's not as bad as it looks. My lawyers think we can work out a plea deal, maybe avoid prison time if I make restitution. But I need character references, people who can testify about my background, my upbringing, my values." I listened in silence, waiting for something that sounded like remorse or accountability. Instead, Marcus sounded like he was already planning his legal strategy, calculating ways to minimize consequences rather than accepting responsibility for his actions. "Dad, are you there?" he asked when I didn't respond immediately. "I'm here," I said. "I'm just trying to understand how we got to this point." "It's complicated," Marcus replied. "The pressure at the firm was incredible. Everyone expected me to maintain a certain lifestyle, to fit in with clients who had money, to look successful. I got in over my head financially, and I made some bad decisions trying to keep up appearances." The explanation felt hollow, a justification rather than an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Marcus was describing his crimes as if they were inevitable responses to social pressure, rather than deliberate choices to steal money from innocent people. He seemed more concerned about maintaining his image than accepting responsibility for the damage he'd caused. "How much money did you take?" I asked. "The FBI says it's around $300,000, he said, his voice getting smaller. "But a lot of that was interest and penalties they added. The actual amount was much less." $300,000? The number was almost incomprehensible to me. I'd never earned that much money in any single year of my life. Marcus had stolen more than I made in 6 years of full-time work, money that belonged to people who'd trusted him with their financial security. "Dad, I need you to write a character reference letter," Marcus continued. "Something about how I was raised, how you taught me right from wrong, how this isn't representative of who I really am. My lawyers say family testimony can make a big difference in sentencing." I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, staring at it as if it were a foreign object. 6 months ago, Marcus had told me I was too embarrassing to attend his professional events. He'd made it clear that my presence in his life was a liability, something that needed to be managed and minimized to protect his career prospects. Now he was asking me to put my reputation on the line to help him avoid the consequences of his criminal behavior. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally. "Time?" Marcus's voice rose with panic. "Dad, the sentencing hearing is in 6 weeks. We don't have time. I need those character references filed with the court as soon as possible." "Then you should have thought about that before you decided I was too embarrassing to be part of your life," I said, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. The line went quiet for a long moment. When Marcus spoke again, his voice carried a note of desperation I'd never heard before. "Dad, please," he whispered. "I know I hurt your feelings, and I'm sorry about that. But this is my life we're talking about. I could go to prison for years if you don't help me." "What about the lives of the people you stole from?" I asked. "What about their trust, their financial security? Did you think about those lives when you were transferring their money into your personal accounts?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was defensive. "Those were corporate accounts, Dad. Insurance companies and big businesses. They'll recover the money. It's not like I stole from widows and orphans." His justification revealed how little he understood about the impact of his crimes. Those corporate accounts represented real people's money, pension funds and insurance claims that would ultimately affect working families. Marcus had convinced himself that his victims were abstract entities rather than flesh-and-blood people who would suffer from his theft. "I need to go," I said. "I'll call you back when I've had time to process all of this." "Dad, wait!" I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my small kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my son's betrayal. The letter from the FBI lay open on the table, its official language describing crimes that carried potential sentences of decades in federal prison. Outside, the children in the courtyard continued playing, their innocent laughter a stark contrast to the moral complexity now dominating my thoughts. The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and distracted workdays. I found myself going through the motions of my job while my mind churned with questions about Marcus's request. Writing a character reference letter would require me to testify about his upbringing, his values, and his moral foundation. But how could I honestly describe raising a son who'd grown up to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who trusted him? Mrs. Patterson noticed my continued distraction during our weekly meeting. This time, she didn't just offer support, she gently insisted on it. "Theo, something is seriously wrong," she said, closing the door to her office and gesturing for me to sit down. "You've been walking around like a ghost for 2 weeks. What's going on?" I found myself telling her everything. The graduation ceremony humiliation, the growing distance between Marcus and me, the FBI investigation, the character reference request. Mrs. Patterson listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me unload the emotional burden I'd been carrying alone. "That's quite a situation," she said when I finished. "What are you thinking about the character reference?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to help him because he's my son. But another part of me wonders if helping him avoid consequences would just enable him to continue making destructive choices." Mrs. Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "In education, we face similar dilemmas when students make serious mistakes. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is allow them to experience the natural consequences of their actions. Other times, support and second chances make the difference between a life that spirals downward and one that finds redemption." "How do you decide which approach to take?" I asked. "It depends on whether the person is truly accepting responsibility or just trying to avoid consequences," she said. "Has Marcus acknowledged the full impact of his actions? Has he shown genuine remorse for the people he hurt? Or is he primarily focused on minimizing his punishment?" Her questions cut to the heart of my uncertainty. Marcus's phone calls had been focused entirely on his legal strategy and potential sentences. He justified his crimes as responses to social pressure rather than accepting them as deliberate choices to hurt innocent people. He'd minimized the impact by characterizing his victims as faceless corporations rather than real individuals who would suffer from his theft. "I think he's more concerned about avoiding prison than making things right," I said. "Then you have your answer," Mrs. Patterson replied gently. "Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when it means watching their child face difficult consequences." That evening, I called Marcus back. He answered on the first ring, his voice eager and hopeful. "Dad, have you thought about the character reference? My lawyers really need it as soon as possible." "I've thought about it," I said, "and I've decided I can't write the letter you're asking for." The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was cold and furious. "You're going to let me go to prison because your feelings got hurt at my graduation?" "This isn't about my feelings," I said. "This is about accountability. You stole $300,000 from people who trusted you. You used your education and your position to commit crimes. Writing a letter trying to minimize those choices wouldn't be helping you. It would be enabling you." "Enabling me?" Marcus's voice rose to a shout. "I'm your son. I'm facing 20 years in federal prison. How can you abandon me when I need you most?" "I'm not abandoning you," I said quietly. "I'm refusing to help you avoid the consequences of your choices. There's a difference." Marcus was crying now, something I hadn't heard since he was a child. But these weren't tears of remorse or genuine regret. They were tears of frustration and self-pity, the emotional outburst of someone who'd finally been forced to confront the reality of his situation. "Please, Dad," he sobbed. "I'll do anything. I'll apologize for what I said at graduation. I'll include you in my life more. I'll make this right between us if you just help me now." His promises felt hollow, desperate bargaining rather than genuine change. Marcus was offering to repair our relationship only because he needed something from me, not because he'd realized the value of family or understood the pain his rejection had caused. "Please, Dad," he sobbed. "I'll do anything. I'll apologize for what I said at graduation. I'll include you in my life more. I'll make this right between us if you just help me now." His promises felt hollow, desperate bargaining rather than genuine change. Marcus was offering to repair our relationship only because he needed something from me, not because he'd realized the value of family or understood the pain his rejection had caused. "When you're ready to take full responsibility for what you've done," I said, "when you're ready to focus on making amends to the people you hurt rather than just avoiding punishment, call me. Until then, you need to face this situation on your own." I hung up the phone and turned it off, knowing that Marcus would probably call back repeatedly throughout the night. The decision felt both heartbreaking and liberating. I was finally setting boundaries with a son who'd spent months treating me like an embarrassment, but I was also watching him face the most serious crisis of his life without my support. The local news picked up the story 3 days later. A brief segment on the evening broadcast mentioned that a junior associate at Peterson, Martinez & Associates had been charged with embezzling client funds. They didn't name Marcus specifically, but they showed footage of the law firm's downtown office building and mentioned that the defendant had been terminated and was facing federal charges. I watched the report from my living room, seeing Marcus's workplace on television and wondering if any of his former colleagues were watching the same broadcast. The professional environment he'd been so desperate to protect was now associated with criminal scandal. The career he'd prioritized over family relationships was effectively over, regardless of his eventual sentence. Mrs. Patterson approached me the next morning with a newspaper clipping. The Portland Tribune had run a more detailed story about the embezzlement case, including Marcus's name and a brief description of the charges. She handed me the article without comment, simply placing a supportive hand on my shoulder before walking away. Reading my son's name in the crime section of the local newspaper was surreal. The article described him as a promising young lawyer who'd apparently succumbed to the temptation of easy money. It mentioned his prestigious education and his position at one of the city's most respected law firms. It also noted that he was facing potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. The article included a quote from one of Marcus's alleged victims, a small business owner whose insurance claim money had been diverted into Marcus's personal accounts. The man described the financial hardship caused by the delay in receiving his legitimate funds, how the theft had forced him to lay off employees and nearly close his business. Reading about the real-world impact of Marcus's crimes made my decision feel more justified, but no less painful. Over the following weeks, I began receiving calls from other character reference seekers. Marcus's defense attorneys had apparently provided them with a list of potential witnesses, and they were systematically contacting everyone who'd known him throughout his life. His high school teachers, college professors, former employers, and family friends all received requests to provide testimony about his character and moral foundation. I spoke with several of these people, curious about their responses to the requests. Most were shocked by the charges and uncertain about how to handle the character reference appeals. A few agreed to write letters focusing on Marcus's academic achievements and early promise. Others, like me, declined to participate in what felt like an attempt to minimize the seriousness of his crimes. Marcus's former high school guidance counselor called me after receiving her own request for a character reference. Mrs. Chen had known Marcus during his teenage years and remembered him as an ambitious student with clear goals for his future. "I'm struggling with this," she admitted during our phone conversation. Marcus was a good student, but he was also very focused on status and appearances even then. I remember him being embarrassed about having to apply for financial aid, worried about what other students would think if they knew his family needed help paying for college. Her observation rang true. Even as a teenager, Marcus had been sensitive about our financial situation and eager to distance himself from anything that suggested economic struggle. His embarrassment about my blue-collar work had roots that went back years before his law school graduation. "Are you planning to write a character reference?" I asked Mrs. Chen. "I don't think so," she said. "Not because I want to see him punished, but because I think the most helpful thing for Marcus right now is to accept full responsibility for his actions. Character references that minimize his crimes won't help him develop the accountability he needs to rebuild his life." Her perspective reinforced my own decision. The people who truly cared about Marcus's long-term well-being weren't trying to help him avoid consequences. They were hoping he'd use this crisis as an opportunity for genuine personal growth. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for late June.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
As the date approached, Marcus's phone calls became more frequent and more desperate. He'd apparently been unsuccessful in securing the character references his lawyers had recommended, and his legal team was revising their strategy accordingly. "Dad, I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said during one of these calls. "I realize I was wrong to be embarrassed about you, wrong to push you away. I want to make things right between us." "I appreciate that," I said. "But making things right will take time and consistent actions, not just words spoken during a crisis." "I know that," he replied, "but I also know that I need your support right now. I'm scared, Dad. I'm really scared about what's going to happen to me." For the first time since this crisis began, Marcus sounded genuinely vulnerable rather than manipulative. His fear was real, and my parental instincts responded to his distress despite my disappointment in his choices. "I'm scared too," I admitted, "but you created this situation through choices you made over several months. The fear you're feeling now is the natural consequence of those choices." "So you're not going to help me at all?" he asked. "I'll always love you," I said, "and I'll be here when you're ready to take full responsibility and work on making genuine amends. But I won't help you minimize or avoid the consequences of stealing $300,000 from innocent people." The line went quiet for a long moment. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "What if I go to prison for years? What if my life is basically over?" "Then you'll have to rebuild it from wherever you end up," I said. "People have recovered from worse situations by accepting responsibility and focusing on making positive changes. But that recovery has to come from you, not from other people helping you avoid accountability." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about the conversation. Marcus's fear was genuine, and my love for him was unchanged despite my disappointment in his actions. But love didn't require me to enable destructive behavior or help him avoid the natural consequences of his choices. The sentencing hearing took place on a Thursday morning in late June. I didn't attend, but I followed the proceedings through local news coverage. Marcus appeared before the federal judge wearing a dark suit and looking considerably thinner than he had at his graduation ceremony a year earlier. His defense attorneys had apparently secured a few character references, but not the extensive collection they'd originally planned. The judge sentenced Marcus to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He was also ordered to pay full restitution to his victims, a financial obligation that would likely follow him for decades. The sentence was within the guidelines for his crimes, but on the higher end of the possible range, suggesting that the judge had not been impressed by the defense's mitigation arguments. I read about the sentencing in the next day's newspaper, studying the photograph of Marcus being led away in handcuffs. He looked small and defeated, nothing like the confident law school graduate who'd been too embarrassed to acknowledge his father's presence at his graduation ceremony. The career he'd prioritized over family relationships was gone. The professional reputation he'd been so desperate to protect was permanently destroyed. The newspaper article included updated information about the impact on Marcus's victims. The small business owner whose insurance claim had been diverted was finally receiving his money, but the delay had caused permanent damage to his company. Several elderly clients whose estate planning funds had been stolen were facing financial hardship that would affect the rest of their lives. Marcus's crimes had created ripple effects that would continue long after his prison sentence ended. I found myself feeling a complex mixture of emotions as I processed the news of his sentencing. Relief that justice had been served and his victims would receive restitution. Sadness that my son's promising future had been destroyed by his own poor choices. Guilt about whether I should have tried harder to guide him away from the path that led to this disaster. And uncertainty about what our relationship would look like when he was eventually released from prison. Mrs. Patterson found me in the school's supply closet that afternoon, ostensibly looking for cleaning supplies, but clearly struggling with heavy thoughts. "I saw the news about your son's sentencing," she said gently. "How are you holding up?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I think I made the right decision by not writing a character reference, but it's hard to watch your child face such serious consequences." "The consequences aren't your fault," she reminded me. "Marcus created this situation through his own choices. You refusing to enable him doesn't make you responsible for his punishment." Her words helped, but the emotional weight of watching my son begin an 8-year prison sentence was overwhelming regardless of the circumstances that led to it. I'd spent 23 years raising Marcus, sacrificing my own comfort and opportunities to provide him with education and advantages I'd never had. Seeing those investments result in federal criminal conviction felt like a fundamental failure of parenting. "Do you think he'll learn from this experience?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "I hope so," I said, "but that will depend on whether he uses this time to develop genuine accountability and empathy, or whether he just focuses on surviving until he can get out and try to rebuild his old life." The first letter from Marcus arrived 2 months after his sentencing. He was housed at a federal prison in California, far enough from Portland that visiting would require significant travel and expense. The letter was handwritten on institutional stationery, his familiar handwriting looking somehow diminished on the cheap paper.
Dad, I've been doing a lot of thinking since I got here. You were right about needing to take responsibility for what I did. I've been meeting with a counselor who's helping me understand how I got to the point where stealing seemed like an acceptable solution to my problems. I'm also working on my GED tutoring program for other inmates who never finished high school. It's humbling work, but it feels more meaningful than anything I did at the law firm. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I hope someday we can rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty instead of embarrassment and pride. I love you, and I'm sorry for everything I put you through, Marcus. I read the letter several times, looking for signs of genuine change versus manipulation designed to win my support. The tone seemed different from our previous conversations, less focused on minimizing his crimes and more focused on understanding how he'd lost his moral compass. The mention of tutoring other inmates suggested he was finding ways to contribute positively even within the constraints of prison life. I wrote back a brief letter, acknowledging his message and expressing cautious hope about his apparent growth. I didn't make any promises about visiting or rebuilding our relationship, but I left the door open for continued correspondence if he continued demonstrating genuine accountability and positive change. Over the following months, Marcus's letters continued arriving regularly. He wrote about the prison education programs he was participating in, his work in the library helping other inmates prepare for their GED exams, and his ongoing counseling sessions focused on understanding the thought patterns that had led to his criminal behavior. Gradually, his letters began including specific acknowledgments of how his crimes had affected his victims, showing that he was developing the empathy that had been missing during his legal proceedings. The transformation seemed genuine, but I remained cautious about fully trusting it. Prison environments could motivate people to present themselves in positive ways without necessarily indicating permanent character change. Only time would reveal whether Marcus's apparent growth was authentic or strategic. A year into his sentence, Marcus wrote a letter that marked a significant shift in our correspondence. Instead of focusing primarily on his own situation, he spent most of the letter asking about my life, my work at the school, and my own well-being. He expressed genuine remorse for the years he'd spent treating me like an embarrassment and acknowledged that his crimes had caused me suffering beyond just the legal consequences he faced. Dad, I know I can't undo the damage I caused, both to my victims and to our relationship, but I want you to know that I finally understand what I lost when I decided you were too embarrassing to be part of my professional life. You spent 30 years providing for me through honest work, sacrificing your own comfort to give me opportunities you never had. I repaid that devotion by committing crimes that destroyed everything you'd worked to help me achieve. I don't expect forgiveness, because I haven't earned it yet, but I hope that when I'm released, I can spend the rest of my life proving that the man you raised is still somewhere inside me, buried under years of misplaced priorities and shameful choices. Reading that letter in my small kitchen on a Sunday morning, I felt something shift inside my chest. For the first time since this nightmare began, Marcus sounded like the son I'd raised, rather than the stranger he'd become. The acknowledgement of my sacrifices, the understanding of how his crimes had affected me personally, and the absence of self-pity marked a genuine transformation from the desperate young man who'd called begging for character references. I started visiting him 6 months later. The federal prison in California was a 5-hour drive from Portland, but I made the journey on alternate weekends when my work schedule allowed. The visiting room was sterile and depressing, filled with plastic chairs and families trying to maintain connections across concrete barriers and razor wire. But seeing Marcus face-to-face for the first time since his sentencing revealed changes that his letters had only hinted at. He looked older, which was expected after 18 months in federal prison. But more significantly, he carried himself differently. The arrogant confidence that had characterized his law school years was gone, replaced by a quiet humility that seemed genuine rather than performed. When he hugged me at the beginning of our first visit, there was no embarrassment about my appearance or concern about who might be watching. He was simply grateful to see his father. Our conversations during those visits covered territory we'd never explored when he was free. Marcus talked about the other inmates he'd met, many of whom came from backgrounds far more challenging than his privileged upbringing. He described learning about their struggles with poverty, addiction, and limited educational opportunities, perspectives that had forced him to confront his own sense of entitlement. "There's a guy here named Roberto who never learned to read until he was 35, Marcus told me during one visit. He was working construction to support his family when he got arrested for tax evasion because he couldn't understand the forms his accountant was filing. He's been teaching me Spanish, and I've been helping him with his reading comprehension. It's made me realize how much I took my education for granted." These stories revealed a developing empathy that had been notably absent during Marcus's legal proceedings. He was beginning to understand that his advantages had come with responsibilities he'd ignored, that his privileged position should have motivated him to help others rather than exploit them for personal gain. The tutoring work he'd mentioned in his letters was expanding. Marcus had become a coordinator for the prison's adult education program, helping inmates prepare for high school equivalency exams and basic literacy tests. The work was voluntary and unpaid, but he spoke about it with more enthusiasm than he'd ever shown for his legal career. Yesterday, a guy named Jerome passed his math GED section after 6 months of struggling with basic algebra, Marcus said, his face lighting up with genuine pride. He's got 3 kids he hasn't seen in 2 years, and passing that test means he'll qualify for work release programs that could get him home sooner. Watching him understand those equations for the first time was better than any legal victory I ever achieved. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. Marcus still struggled with self-pity occasionally, and his understanding of his crime's full impact continued developing slowly. But the direction of his change was consistent and encouraging. He was becoming someone who thought beyond his own immediate needs and interests. During one particularly significant visit, Marcus brought up the character reference requests that had created such tension between us during his legal proceedings. "I've been thinking about why you refused to write that letter," he said, his voice careful and thoughtful. "At the time, I thought you were just angry about the graduation thing, maybe trying to punish me for hurting your feelings. But now I understand that you were trying to protect me from avoiding the accountability I needed to experience." I nodded, remembering the difficulty of that decision. It wasn't about punishment. It was about not enabling you to continue making destructive choices by helping you minimize the consequences. "The thing is," Marcus continued, "if you had written that letter, if the judge had given me a lighter sentence because of character references, I probably would have learned all the wrong lessons from this experience. I would have focused on being more careful about not getting caught, rather than examining why I thought stealing was acceptable in the first place." His insight surprised me. The Marcus who'd been arrested 18 months earlier wouldn't have been capable of that level of self-reflection. Prison had apparently provided him with the time and motivation for honest introspection that his comfortable professional life had never required.
The 8-year sentence felt like the end of the world when it happened, he admitted. But it's turning out to be the best thing that could have happened to me. I needed to lose everything I thought mattered to discover what actually matters. We talked about his plans for life after release, which were dramatically different from the corporate law career he'd been pursuing before his arrest. Marcus was considering social work or education, fields where he could use his experience with the criminal justice system to help other people avoid the mistakes he'd made. "I know I'll never practice law again," he said. "My license is permanently revoked, and honestly, I'm glad about that. The legal profession brought out the worst parts of my personality, the status-seeking and money-focused thinking that led to my crimes. I want to do something that brings out better parts of who I can be." The visiting room conversations weren't always heavy or philosophical. We also talked about books Marcus was reading, movies he was looking forward to seeing when he was released, and memories from his childhood that he was re-examining with adult perspective. These lighter moments helped rebuild the emotional connection that had been damaged by years of distance and his criminal behavior. Marcus asked about my work at Lincoln Elementary, showing genuine interest in the children I served and the projects I was completing. He remembered Mrs. Patterson from stories I'd told over the years and asked me to give her his regards and his apologies for any embarrassment his actions might have caused me professionally. "Actually," I told him, "Mrs. Patterson has been incredibly supportive throughout this whole situation. She never made me feel judged or ashamed about what you'd done. She understood that your choices weren't a reflection of my parenting or my character." "That's generous of her," Marcus said. "When I get out, I'd like to write her a letter thanking her for supporting you during the worst period of your life. My actions put you in an impossible position, and I'm grateful you had people who understood that." These expressions of concern for how his crimes had affected other people marked another significant development in Marcus's emotional growth. He was learning to consider the ripple effects of his actions rather than focusing exclusively on direct consequences to himself. 2 years into his sentence, Marcus earned placement in a minimum security work camp where inmates with good behavior records were allowed to participate in community service projects. He was assigned to a crew that maintained public parks and recreational facilities, physical labor that reminded me of my own work maintaining the elementary school. "It's funny," he said during a visit after starting the work camp assignment, "I spent my whole adult life trying to avoid the kind of physical work you do every day. I thought manual labor was beneath me, something to be embarrassed about. But there's something deeply satisfying about maintaining spaces where families can enjoy time together. I'm learning skills I never thought I'd need or want." The work camp also allowed more frequent communication. Marcus could call twice a week instead of the monthly calls permitted in the higher security facility, and our conversations became more regular and natural. He started asking for advice about practical matters, treating me as a source of wisdom rather than an embarrassment to be managed. "There's a guy here who's struggling with his teenage son," Marcus told me during one call. "The kid is angry about his father being in prison and won't accept phone calls or visit.
I told him about how patient you were with me, even when I was pushing you away, how you kept the door open for reconciliation without pressuring me to change. Do you have any advice I could pass along? Being asked to share parenting wisdom with another inmate's family felt like a remarkable reversal from the days when Marcus considered my guidance irrelevant to his sophisticated professional life. He was beginning to value the emotional intelligence and relationship skills I'd developed through years of single parenting and working with children. The third year of Marcus's sentence brought news that one of his victims, the small business owner whose insurance claim money had been diverted, wanted to participate in a victim-offender mediation program. These sessions allowed criminals to meet with people they'd harmed, providing opportunities for accountability and healing that traditional court proceedings often couldn't achieve. Marcus was terrified about the prospect of facing someone whose life he damaged directly. He called me immediately after learning about the mediation opportunity, his voice shaking with anxiety and uncertainty. "What if he just wants to yell at me?" Marcus asked. "What if seeing me in person makes his anger worse instead of helping him heal?" "Then you'll listen to him yell," I said. "You'll accept his anger without defending yourself or making excuses. You'll give him whatever he needs from that interaction, even if it's just the opportunity to tell you directly how much damage you caused." "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that," he admitted. "You've survived 3 years in federal prison," I reminded him. "You've rebuilt yourself from someone who stole money to avoid facing his problems into someone who tutors other inmates and maintains public parks. You're stronger than you think." The mediation session took place a month later. Marcus called me afterward, emotionally drained but somehow lighter than he'd sounded in years. "His name is David Martinez," Marcus said. "He's 58 years old, owns a small landscaping business that employs 6 people. When I stole his insurance money, he had to choose between laying off half his crew or taking out loans at high interest rates to cover his expenses while waiting for the claim to be processed. David had chosen to take out the loans, sacrificing his own financial security to protect his employees' livelihoods. The interest and fees had cost him nearly $30,000 beyond the original stolen amount, money that came directly out of his family's savings and his children's college funds. He brought pictures of his employees," Marcus continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Men with families who depend on their paychecks, guys who've worked for him for years, building relationships with clients. He made me understand that stealing from his business wasn't just stealing from some abstract corporate entity. It was stealing from working families, from children's educational futures, from people who trusted him to provide stable employment." The mediation had lasted 3 hours. David Martinez had indeed expressed anger, but he'd also shared the broader context of how Marcus's crimes had affected his community. The delayed insurance payment had created a cascade of financial problems that extended far beyond David's business, affecting suppliers, subcontractors, and customers whose projects had been delayed or canceled. "But at the end," Marcus said, "David told me that he forgave me. Not because he thought I deserved forgiveness, but because carrying anger for 3 years had been exhausting for him. He said he needed to forgive me for his own peace of mind, not for mine." David Martinez had also brought a message that would shape the remainder of Marcus's incarceration and his plans for life after release. David's landscaping business had started working with at-risk youth, providing job training and mentorship opportunities for teenagers aging out of the foster care system. He suggested that Marcus might consider similar work when he was released, using his experience with the criminal justice system to help young people avoid the mistakes he'd made. He said that the best way I could honor the damage I caused would be to prevent other people from causing similar damage, Marcus explained. Not by lecturing them about right and wrong, but by helping them build lives where crime doesn't seem like a reasonable option. This conversation marked another turning point in Marcus's development. He began researching organizations that worked with at-risk youth, studying the root causes of criminal behavior, and developing ideas for programs that might address the social pressures and personal insecurities that had contributed to his own poor choices. Mrs. Patterson was nearing retirement when I shared David Martinez's suggestion with her during one of our weekly meetings.
She'd been following Marcus's progress through my updates over the years, and his transformation had apparently given her ideas about her own legacy projects. You know, Theo, she said thoughtfully, we've been struggling with how to support some of our older students who are aging out of our elementary programs. Many of them will transition to middle schools where they won't receive the kind of individual attention they get here. Maybe there's an opportunity for Marcus to contribute something positive when he's released. Her suggestion surprised me. I'd assumed that Marcus's criminal record would make him unemployable in any field involving children or education. But Mrs. Patterson explained that many successful intervention programs were staffed by people with personal experience overcoming significant challenges. Obviously, he'd need to complete his sentence successfully and demonstrate sustained positive change, she clarified. But his combination of education, communication skills, and hard-won understanding of how good people can make terrible choices might be exactly what some of our struggling students need to hear. The possibility of Marcus eventually contributing to the elementary school where I'd worked for 30 years felt like a profound form of redemption. Not redemption in the sense of erasing his crimes or minimizing their impact, but redemption in the sense of transforming devastating mistakes into opportunities to prevent similar tragedies. I shared Mrs. Patterson's comments with Marcus during our next visit. His reaction was immediate and emotional, tears streaming down his face as he processed the possibility that his criminal experience might eventually be transformed into something helpful for vulnerable children. "She would consider letting me work with kids even after what I've done?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "She'd consider it if you continue demonstrating the kind of growth you've shown over the past 3 years," I clarified. "But there would be extensive vetting, background checks, supervised probation, and probably years of proving yourself in less sensitive roles first." Marcus nodded eagerly, already thinking through the steps that might eventually lead to such an opportunity. He'd found his calling in the prison education programs, and the possibility of expanding that work to help at-risk youth in the community gave him a concrete goal to work toward during his remaining years of incarceration. The 4th year of Marcus's sentence brought news that he'd been selected for an early release program based on his exemplary behavior and his participation in rehabilitation activities. Instead of serving the full 8 years, he would be eligible for supervised release after 6 years, with the remaining 2 years served under strict community supervision. The news was exciting, but also terrifying. Marcus had adapted to prison life, finding purpose and identity within the structured environment of incarceration. Returning to the outside world would require him to maintain his positive changes while navigating temptations and pressures that had contributed to his original crimes. "I'm scared that I'll revert to my old patterns once I'm out," he admitted during one of our calls. "Prison is insulated from the social pressures and materialistic values that led me to think stealing was acceptable. What if I get out and start caring about status and money again?" His concern was legitimate. Many ex-offenders struggled with recidivism precisely because they returned to environments and social circles that reinforced the attitudes and behaviors that had led to their crimes. Marcus would need to build an entirely new life with different priorities and different relationships. "That's why you need to surround yourself with people who value the person you've become rather than the person you used to be," I said. "People who care more about your character than your income, more about your contributions to the community than your professional status." We began planning for his transition to supervised release, identifying housing options, potential employment opportunities, and support networks that would help him maintain his positive trajectory. The work would be challenging, but Marcus's transformation during his incarceration had given him tools and perspectives that hadn't existed when he'd first entered the criminal justice system. Marcus's release date was set for 18 months in the future, giving us time to prepare carefully for his reintegration into society. He would initially live in a halfway house in Portland, allowing him to gradually adjust to life outside prison while remaining under close supervision. The prospect of my son returning to Portland after 6 years in federal prison was both hopeful and complicated. Our relationship had been rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and accountability, but maintaining that foundation would require continued effort from both of us. Marcus would need to resist the temptation to slip back into old patterns of entitlement and materialism.
I would need to continue setting healthy boundaries while supporting his legitimate efforts to build a better life. During one of our final visits before his transfer to the halfway house, Marcus brought up the character reference requests that had caused such conflict between us during his legal proceedings. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice serious and thoughtful. "If you had written that character reference letter when I asked for it, if you had helped me get a lighter sentence, I would have spent the last 5 years blaming everyone else for my problems instead of taking responsibility for my choices." He paused, looking around the visiting room where we'd had so many difficult and transformative conversations. I would have told myself that my crimes weren't that serious, that the punishment was excessive, that I was a victim of an unfair system rather than someone who'd chosen to hurt innocent people. I would have gotten out of prison angry and resentful instead of grateful and committed to making amends. His reflection revealed the wisdom he'd gained through experiencing the full consequences of his actions. The 8-year sentence that had seemed devastating when it was imposed had provided him with the time and motivation necessary for genuine transformation. A lighter sentence might have prevented that growth by allowing him to maintain his self-deceptive narratives about his crimes. "Refusing to enable me was the most loving thing you could have done," Marcus said. "Even though it meant watching me face years in prison, even though it meant being criticized by people who thought you should support your family regardless of their actions." I thought about the criticism he mentioned. Some relatives and family friends had indeed questioned my decision not to provide character references, suggesting that family loyalty should override concerns of accountability. Their disapproval had been painful, but it had been outweighed by my conviction that true love sometimes requires allowing people to face the consequences of their choices. "I'm proud of the man you've become during these years," I told Marcus. "Not because you've suffered, but because you've chosen to grow from your suffering instead of just enduring it." The day of Marcus's transfer to the halfway house marked the beginning of a new chapter in both our lives. He would face the challenges of rebuilding his life in the community while maintaining the positive changes he'd developed during incarceration. I would continue working at Lincoln Elementary while supporting his transition and monitoring his progress. The work would be challenging, but Marcus's transformation during his incarceration had given him tools and perspectives that hadn't existed when he'd first entered the criminal justice system. Marcus's release date was set for 18 months in the future, giving us time to prepare carefully for his reintegration into society. He would initially live in a halfway house in Portland, allowing him to gradually adjust to life outside prison while remaining under close supervision. The prospect of my son returning to Portland after 6 years in federal prison was both hopeful and complicated. Our relationship had been rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and accountability, but maintaining that foundation would require continued effort from both of us. Marcus would need to resist the temptation to slip back into old patterns of entitlement and materialism. I would need to continue setting healthy boundaries while supporting his legitimate efforts to build a better life. During one of our final visits before his transfer to the halfway house, Marcus brought up the character reference requests that had caused such conflict between us during his legal proceedings. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice serious and thoughtful. "If you had written that character reference letter when I asked for it, if you had helped me get a lighter sentence, I would have spent the last 5 years blaming everyone else for my problems instead of taking responsibility for my choices." He paused, looking around the visiting room where we'd had so many difficult and transformative conversations. I would have told myself that my crimes weren't that serious, that the punishment was excessive, that I was a victim of an unfair system rather than someone who'd chosen to hurt innocent people. I would have gotten out of prison angry and resentful instead of grateful and committed to making amends. His reflection revealed the wisdom he'd gained through experiencing the full consequences of his actions. The 8-year sentence that had seemed devastating when it was imposed had provided him with the time and motivation necessary for genuine transformation. A lighter sentence might have prevented that growth by allowing him to maintain his self-deceptive narratives about his crimes. "Refusing to enable me was the most loving thing you could have done," Marcus said. "Even though it meant watching me face years in prison, even though it meant—"
Mrs. Patterson had officially retired the previous year, but she left detailed notes about potential opportunities for Marcus to contribute to youth programs once he'd established himself successfully in the community.
Her successor, a younger principal named Mr. Rodriguez, had expressed cautious interest in exploring those possibilities once Marcus had demonstrated sustained stability and commitment to positive change. The halfway house program lasted 6 months, during which Marcus worked at a nonprofit organization that provided job training for ex-offenders. He started as a maintenance worker, using skills he developed during his prison work camp assignments, but gradually took on responsibilities helping other program participants develop resumes and interview skills. His supervisor at the nonprofit was a woman named Janet Morrison, who'd been working with formerly incarcerated individuals for over a decade. She understood the challenges of reintegration and the importance of providing structure and accountability during the transition period. Marcus is one of the most dedicated participants we've had, Janet told me during a family meeting 6 months into his halfway house placement. He's not just focused on meeting the minimum requirements for his supervision, he's actively looking for ways to contribute to the program and support other participants who are struggling with their transitions. This feedback confirmed what I'd observed during my visits with Marcus throughout his halfway house placement. He was maintaining the humility and service-oriented attitude he'd developed during incarceration, resisting the temptation to view his release as an opportunity to return to his previous lifestyle. After successfully completing the halfway house program, Marcus was approved for independent housing and continued his work at the nonprofit organization. He rented a small studio apartment near downtown Portland, furnished with basic necessities and nothing that suggested materialism or status seeking. His focus remained on building a life based on contribution rather than consumption. 2 years after his release from prison, Marcus had been promoted to a program coordinator position at the nonprofit, developing and implementing services for other ex-offenders transitioning back into the community. His combination of education, personal experience with the criminal justice system, and genuine commitment to helping others made him uniquely effective in this role. He'd also begun volunteering with youth programs in the evenings and weekends, working with teenagers who were at risk of making the kinds of mistakes that had led to his own incarceration. These programs allowed him to share his story honestly while helping young people develop the decision-making skills and support networks they needed to avoid criminal behavior. The relationship between Marcus and me had evolved into something healthier and more authentic than anything we'd shared during his professional career. We met regularly for coffee or simple meals, conversations that focused on his work, my retirement planning, and our shared interest in helping vulnerable young people build better lives. "You know what's strange?" Marcus said during one of these conversations. "I'm happier now, working at a nonprofit and living in a studio apartment than I ever was when I was making 6-figure salary and living in a luxury condo. Back then, I was constantly worried about maintaining appearances and competing with colleagues. Now, I wake up every day knowing that my work actually helps people." His observation reflected a fundamental shift in values that had occurred during his years of incarceration and supervised release. Marcus had learned to find satisfaction in contribution rather than accumulation, in authentic relationships rather than strategic networking, and personal growth rather than professional advancement. The opportunity to work with Lincoln Elementary students finally materialized during Marcus's 3rd year post-release. Mr. Rodriguez had been following Marcus's progress through my updates and had observed his volunteer work with at-risk youth in the community. When the school received a grant to fund an after-school mentorship program for older elementary students, Mr. Rodriguez approached me about whether Marcus might be interested in applying for the coordinator position. The application process was extensive, involving background checks, interviews with school board members, meetings with parent groups, and detailed review of Marcus's criminal history and rehabilitation efforts. Some parents expressed concerns about having an ex-felon working with their children, concerns that were addressed through town hall meetings where Marcus shared his story and answered questions about his transformation. "I understand your hesitation about trusting me with your children," Marcus said during one particularly challenging parent meeting. "If I were in your position, I would have the same concerns. All I can tell you is that my experience with the criminal justice system has taught me how devastating poor choices can be, not just for the person making them, but for entire families and communities.
That's exactly the lesson I want to help your children learn before they're faced with situations where those choices might seem appealing. His honesty and humility gradually won over most of the skeptical parents. The few who remained uncomfortable with his involvement were accommodated through alternative after-school options, ensuring that the program moved forward without creating division within the school community. Marcus's work with the elementary school mentorship program exceeded everyone's expectations, including his own. He developed innovative approaches to helping older students transition successfully to middle school, focusing on building decision-making skills, emotional regulation, and healthy relationship patterns. His combination of education, personal experience overcoming significant challenges, and genuine care for the students, creating programming that was both effective and deeply meaningful. Mr. Marcus tells us stories about making bad choices and how they affected other people, one of his students told me during a casual conversation at school. He doesn't just say, "Don't do drugs" or "Don't steal things." He helps us understand how our choices affect our families and our communities, and how we can make choices that help people instead of hurting them. The student's comment captured the essence of Marcus's approach to youth mentorship. Rather than delivering abstract moral lectures, he shared concrete examples of how decisions created consequences that rippled through entire networks of relationships. His criminal experience provided him with powerful illustrations of these concepts that resonated with students in ways that traditional curriculum often couldn't achieve. 5 years after his release from prison, Marcus had become a respected figure in Portland's youth development community. He'd completed additional education in social work, earning credentials that complemented his experiential knowledge and enhanced his credibility with funding organizations and partner agencies. His program at Lincoln Elementary had become a model that other schools were adapting for their own at-risk student populations. The transformation was complete but ongoing. Marcus continued participating in counseling and accountability groups for ex-offenders, maintaining the support networks that had been crucial to his successful reintegration. He lived simply but comfortably, finding satisfaction in work that contributed to his community rather than just his bank account. Our relationship had become one of mutual respect and genuine affection, based on shared values and honest communication rather than obligation or social expectations. Marcus no longer felt embarrassed about my blue-collar background. Instead, he frequently credited my work ethic and practical wisdom with providing him the foundation he'd needed to rebuild his life after his catastrophic mistakes. "People sometimes ask me what I learned in prison," Marcus told me during a recent conversation. "The real learning didn't happen in prison. It happened when I finally understood that the man I'd been embarrassed to call my father was actually the person I should have been trying to become all along." His journey from embarrassment to respect, from entitlement to accountability, from materialism to service had taken nearly a decade to complete. The process had been painful for both of us, involving years of separation, disappointment, and uncertainty about whether genuine change was possible. But the outcome had exceeded anything I dared to hope for during the darkest days of his legal troubles. Marcus had not only avoided becoming a repeat offender, he'd become a force for positive change in his community. His criminal experience, rather than defining him as a failure, had become the foundation for a career dedicated to preventing other young people from making similar mistakes. His embarrassment about my working-class background had been replaced by pride in the values and work ethic I've modeled throughout his childhood. The character references he desperately sought during his legal proceedings ultimately came from the people he'd touched through his post-incarceration service work. Teachers, social workers, nonprofit administrators, and parents of the children he mentored have provided recommendations that helped him secure employment, housing, and community acceptance.
These references were based on observed actions rather than childhood memories, on demonstrated change rather than past potential. Standing in my small kitchen on a Sunday morning, reading Marcus's latest letter describing his work with a particularly challenging group of middle school students, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The son who'd once told me I was too embarrassing to attend his professional events was now someone whose company I genuinely enjoyed and whose work I deeply respected. The federal investigation that had seemed like a catastrophe 8 years earlier had ultimately become the catalyst for the most meaningful period of both our lives. Marcus had discovered his calling in serving vulnerable young people, and I'd learned that love sometimes required the courage to allow people to face the full consequences of their choices rather than enabling them to avoid accountability. The story wasn't over. Marcus would continue facing challenges as he built his new life, and our relationship would continue evolving as we both grew older and learned from our experiences. But the foundation had been laid for a future based on authenticity rather than appearances, service rather than status, and genuine care rather than social obligation. The morning sun streamed through my kitchen window, illuminating the letter in my hands and warming the space where I'd made so many difficult decisions during the years of Marcus's legal troubles and incarceration. Outside, I could hear children playing in the apartment complex courtyard, their laughter reminiscent of the students at Lincoln Elementary who benefited from Marcus's mentorship programs. It was a beautiful sound, full of hope and possibility, marking the beginning of another day in a life that had been rebuilt from the wreckage of devastating mistakes and transformed into something more meaningful than either Marcus or I had ever imagined possible. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in October, 7 years after Marcus's release from federal prison. I was reviewing maintenance schedules for Lincoln Elementary when my phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was professional but warm, introducing herself as Dr. Sarah Chen from Portland State University's School of Social Work. "Mr. Brennan, I'm calling about your son Marcus," she said. "He's applied for our doctoral program in social work, and we're conducting reference interviews as part of our admissions process. Would you have a few minutes to discuss his character and qualifications?" I set down my paperwork and settled back in my chair, thinking about how different this conversation would be from the FBI investigation that had started this journey over a decade earlier. Then I'd been asked to vouch for someone whose character was fundamentally unknown to me, despite 23 years of parenting. Now I was being asked about someone whose transformation I'd witnessed firsthand through years of difficulty and growth. "I'd be happy to talk about Marcus," I said. "He's become someone I'm genuinely proud to know, not just as his father, but as a member of our community." Dr. Chen asked thoughtful questions about Marcus's work ethic, his interactions with vulnerable populations, his ability to handle stress and setbacks, and his commitment to professional ethics. Each question allowed me to share specific examples of Marcus's growth and contributions over the past 7 years. "He's worked with some of our most challenging students," I told her when she asked about his experience with difficult cases. "Kids who've been written off by other programs, families dealing with multiple crises. Marcus has a way of connecting with people who are struggling because he's honest about his own struggles and recovery. He doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he's committed to walking alongside people as they find their own paths forward." The conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering Marcus's volunteer work, his professional development, his ongoing participation in accountability groups, and his relationships with colleagues and community members. Dr. Chen seemed particularly interested in how Marcus had maintained his positive trajectory over such an extended period. "Sustainability is crucial in our field," she explained. "We see many people who are passionate about helping others immediately after their own recovery or transformation, but maintaining that commitment over years requires a deeper foundation. From what you're describing, Marcus seems to have developed genuine resilience and purpose." After the call ended, I reflected on how naturally the positive reference had flowed. Unlike the character reference requests during Marcus's legal proceedings, this conversation had felt authentic and hopeful. I wasn't being asked to minimize Marcus's past mistakes or exaggerate his virtues. Instead, I was sharing observations about someone who demonstrated sustained positive change through consistent actions over many years. Marcus called me the next evening to let me know about his application to the doctoral program. His voice carried excitement but also nervous energy about the possibility of furthering his education in a field where he'd already found meaningful work. "The program would allow me to develop research skills and policy expertise," he explained. "I'd like to study intervention strategies for young people who are aging out of foster care, since they're at such high risk for criminal justice involvement. Maybe I could help design programs that address some of the systemic issues that contribute to crime, rather than just responding after people have already made destructive choices." His vision for using advanced education to address root causes of criminal behavior impressed me. Marcus had moved beyond simply helping individuals recover from poor decisions to thinking about how society could prevent those decisions from seeming necessary in the first place. His perspective had evolved from personal redemption to systemic change. The doctoral program acceptance letter arrived in December, along with news that Marcus had been awarded a full scholarship based on his academic potential and his demonstrated commitment to social justice work. The scholarship would allow him to pursue his studies without accumulating debt, ensuring that his financial pressures wouldn't compromise his focus on learning and research. "They want me to start in January," Marcus said when he called to share the news. "It's a 3-year program with intensive research requirements, but I'd be able to continue my work at the nonprofit part-time." Dr. Chen said my experience with the criminal justice system and youth development would be valuable for their research projects. I thought about the journey that had brought Marcus to this point. From a young lawyer who'd stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford, to a doctoral student whose personal experience would contribute to academic research aimed at preventing crime. The transformation was complete, but it had taken over a decade of consistent effort and accountability. During the winter break before Marcus started his doctoral studies, we took a trip together to visit some of the national parks I'd discovered during my travels after his arrest. It was our first extended vacation together since he was a child, and the experience revealed how much our relationship had deepened and matured over the years. We spent 5 days camping in Death Valley, hiking desert trails, and talking about everything from his research interests to my retirement plans. The conversations flowed naturally, without the careful navigation that had characterized our interactions during his early recovery. Marcus was genuinely interested in my perspectives and experiences, asking questions about my work with children and seeking advice about balancing graduate school with his ongoing community commitments. "You know what strikes me about this place?" Marcus said one evening as we sat around our campfire watching stars emerge in the desert sky. "It's completely unforgiving if you make serious mistakes. No water, extreme temperatures, dangerous terrain. But it's also incredibly beautiful if you approach it with respect and preparation." His observation felt like a metaphor for the journey he'd traveled from criminal conviction to doctoral studies. The consequences of his mistakes had been harsh and unforgiving, but approaching his recovery with respect for the process and careful preparation had ultimately led to something beautiful and meaningful. We talked about forgiveness during that trip, both the forgiveness he'd received from others and the ongoing work of forgiving himself.
Marcus had participated in additional victim-offender mediation sessions over the years, meeting with 2 more of the people whose money he'd stolen. These conversations had been difficult but healing for everyone involved, providing opportunities for accountability and closure that traditional criminal proceedings often couldn't achieve. "David Martinez told me something during our last conversation that really stuck with me," Marcus said, referring to the small business owner whose insurance claim he'd originally stolen. "He said that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it wasn't serious. It's about refusing to let past mistakes define everyone's future forever. He forgave me not because I deserved it, but because holding on to anger was preventing him from moving forward with his own life." This understanding of forgiveness as a gift to the giver rather than a reward for the receiver had helped Marcus develop a healthier relationship with his own guilt and shame. He continued accepting responsibility for his crimes and their consequences, but he'd learned to channel that accountability into positive action rather than self-destructive rumination. The doctoral program proved challenging but rewarding. Marcus's coursework covered research methodology, policy analysis, human development, and social systems theory. His professors recognized that his personal experience with the criminal justice system provided valuable insights that complemented his academic learning, and they encouraged him to incorporate those perspectives into his research projects. His first-year research project examined recidivism rates among white-collar criminals, comparing outcomes for offenders who received character reference support during sentencing with those who faced full accountability without mitigation. The findings suggested that offenders who experienced complete consequences for their actions were actually less likely to reoffend than those whose sentences were reduced through character references and other mitigation strategies.
The data supports what you intuited when you refused to write my character reference, Marcus told me when he shared his preliminary findings. Offenders who face full accountability are forced to confront the reality of their choices in ways that might be avoided if consequences are minimized. That confrontation, while painful, appears to be crucial for genuine behavior change. His research was gaining attention from other academics and policymakers who were interested in evidence-based approaches to criminal justice reform. Marcus presented his findings at several conferences, sharing his unique perspective as someone who had both committed white-collar crimes and studied their prevention. During his second year of doctoral studies, Marcus was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee examining federal sentencing guidelines for financial crimes. His testimony combined personal experience with research findings, arguing that accountability and rehabilitation were not opposing goals but complementary approaches to reducing crime and supporting victims. "I'm here not to advocate for harsher or more lenient sentences," Marcus told the congressional panel, "but to suggest that the most effective sentences are those that require offenders to face the full reality of their choices while providing opportunities for meaningful change. Character references and mitigation strategies that minimize accountability may actually interfere with the psychological processes that lead to genuine rehabilitation." His research was gaining attention from other academics and policymakers who were interested in evidence-based approaches to criminal justice reform. Marcus presented his findings at several conferences, sharing his unique perspective as someone who had both committed white-collar crimes and studied their prevention. During his second year of doctoral studies, Marcus was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee examining federal sentencing guidelines for financial crimes. His testimony combined personal experience with research findings, arguing that accountability and rehabilitation were not opposing goals but complementary approaches to reducing crime and supporting victims. "I'm here not to advocate for harsher or more lenient sentences," Marcus told the congressional panel, "but to suggest that the most effective sentences are those that require offenders to face the full reality of their choices while providing opportunities for meaningful change. Character references and mitigation strategies that minimize accountability may actually interfere with the psychological processes that lead to genuine rehabilitation." His testimony was covered by several national news outlets, transforming Marcus into a recognized voice in criminal justice policy discussions. The attention was sometimes uncomfortable for someone who valued privacy and humility, but Marcus understood that his unique perspective carried responsibilities to contribute to broader conversations about crime prevention and rehabilitation. The third year of his doctoral program focused on dissertation research examining intervention strategies for youth aging out of foster care. Marcus worked with several agencies in Portland to study which approaches were most effective at preventing criminal justice involvement among this vulnerable population. His findings suggested that programs combining practical support with emotional mentorship had significantly better outcomes than those focusing exclusively on either dimension. "These young people need both concrete help with housing and employment and authentic relationships with adults who believe in their potential," Marcus explained when he defended his dissertation research. "Programs that provide only practical support often fail because they don't address the emotional trauma and attachment issues that contribute to risky decision-making. Programs that focus only on relationship building often fail because they don't help with the immediate survival needs that can drive desperate choices." His research contributed to policy changes in Oregon's foster care system, influencing how transition services were designed and funded. The practical impact of his academic work gave Marcus deep satisfaction, knowing that his studies were translating into better outcomes for vulnerable young people. Dr. Chen served as Marcus's dissertation advisor throughout his doctoral studies, and she became a mentor who helped him navigate the academic world while maintaining his commitment to direct service work. During his dissertation defense, she introduced him to the examination committee with words that captured the uniqueness of his journey. "Marcus represents something rare in academic social work," she said. "He brings lived experience with both perpetrating harm and experiencing redemption, combined with rigorous research skills and genuine commitment to systemic change. His perspective enriches our understanding of human behavior and social policy in ways that traditional academic preparation alone could never achieve." Marcus graduated summa cum laude from the doctoral program in May, 14 years after his original arrest for embezzlement. The graduation ceremony was held at Portland State University's largest auditorium, filled with families celebrating their loved ones' academic achievements. I sat in the front row, wearing the same navy suit I'd worn to Marcus's law school graduation 15 years earlier, but feeling completely different about the experience. When Marcus's name was called, I stood and cheered loudly, just as I had at his law school graduation. But this time, Marcus's face when he spotted me in the crowd showed pure gratitude rather than embarrassment. After receiving his diploma, he looked directly at me and mouthed the words "thank you" before walking across the stage to join his fellow graduates. The celebration afterward was simple but meaningful. Marcus, myself, Dr. Chen, several colleagues from his nonprofit work, and some of the youth he'd mentored over the years gathered at a nearby restaurant to mark his achievement. The conversation focused on his future plans and the impact his research might have on criminal justice and youth development policies. Dr. Brennan, one of his former mentorship students, said during the dinner, using Marcus's new title with obvious pride, "Are you going to keep working with kids like us, or are you going to become one of those professors who just write papers?" Marcus laughed at the question, which cut straight to the heart of his post-graduation choices. He'd received offers from several universities to join their faculties, but he'd also been approached by nonprofit organizations and government agencies interested in his combination of research skills and practical experience. "I'm going to do both," Marcus said. "I've accepted a position with the state legislature's Criminal Justice Reform Committee, where I'll be doing policy research and analysis. But I'm also going to continue working with youth programs here in Portland. The research and the direct service work inform each other in ways that make both more effective." His decision to remain in Portland and continue his community-based work reflected the values he developed during his recovery journey. Rather than seeking prestige or financial advancement, Marcus was choosing opportunities that aligned with his purpose and allowed him to maintain the relationships and commitments that had supported his transformation. The summer after his graduation, Marcus and I collaborated on a project that neither of us could have imagined during the darkest days of his legal troubles. Lincoln Elementary had received a grant to develop a comprehensive prevention program for students showing early signs of behavioral problems, and the school board had approved Marcus as the program's research coordinator. Working together at the elementary school where I'd spent my entire career felt like a profound form of redemption. Marcus would spend several days each week at Lincoln, conducting assessments with at-risk students, developing intervention strategies, and training teachers in early identification techniques. His office was just down the hall from the maintenance shop where I'd worked for 30 years. "It's surreal sometimes," Marcus said during one of our planning meetings in the school conference room. "I'm sitting in the same building where you worked all those years to provide for my education, but now I'm here as someone trying to prevent other kids from making the mistakes I made. It feels like everything has come full circle, but at a higher level." The Lincoln Elementary Prevention Program became a model for other schools in the district. Marcus's research documented significant improvements in academic performance and behavioral outcomes for students who participated in the intervention services. His combination of academic credentials and authentic understanding of how good kids can make destructive choices made him uniquely effective at reaching struggling students and their families. Parents who had initially been skeptical about having an ex-felon working with their children became some of Marcus's strongest advocates after seeing the positive impact of his work. His honesty about his own mistakes, combined with his obvious commitment to preventing—
"Dr. Brennan doesn't talk down to our kids," one parent said during a school board meeting where the prevention program was being evaluated for continued funding. "He treats them with respect while helping them understand that their choices matter. My daughter has learned more about decision-making and personal responsibility from his program than from anywhere else." 5 years after completing his doctoral studies, Marcus had become a recognized expert in youth crime prevention and criminal justice reform. His research had influenced policy changes at state and federal levels, and his prevention programs had been adopted by school districts across the Pacific Northwest. But the achievement that meant the most to him was the relationships he'd built with hundreds of young people who were now making better choices because of his mentorship and guidance.
The irony wasn't lost on either of us that the son who'd once found me too embarrassing to acknowledge publicly was now someone whose professional reputation elevated my own standing in the community. Teachers and administrators at Lincoln Elementary frequently asked about Marcus's work and expressed pride that their maintenance supervisor had raised someone making such significant contributions to education and criminal justice reform. "Your son's research is being cited in graduate programs across the country," Mr. Rodriguez told me during one of our administrative meetings. "Lincoln Elementary is mentioned in academic journals because of the prevention program he developed here. It's remarkable how his personal journey has become such a force for positive change." Marcus's transformation had indeed become a force for positive change, but not just for himself or his immediate community. His story was being used in criminal justice training programs to illustrate the potential for genuine rehabilitation. His research was informing policy discussions about sentencing, prevention, and victim offender mediation. His direct service work was changing lives for vulnerable young people who might otherwise have followed destructive paths. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of his transformation was the relationship between us. The distance and embarrassment that had characterized our interactions during his legal career had been replaced by mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared purpose. We worked together, traveled together, and enjoyed each other's company in ways that would have been impossible during his earlier focus on status and appearances. The annual Lincoln Elementary Awards ceremony had become a tradition where Marcus and I were both recognized for our contributions to the school community. Marcus received acknowledgement for his research and prevention programs, while I was honored for my decades of maintenance work and my role in supporting his transformation. Standing together on the same stage where I'd once been too embarrassing for him to acknowledge felt like a complete reversal of everything that had driven us apart. "Ladies and gentlemen," the current principal announced during the most recent award ceremony, "it's unusual to honor both a father and son in the same evening, but the Brennan family represents something special about the power of accountability, growth, and service to others. Theo Brennan has kept our school running smoothly for over 30 years, and his son, Dr. Marcus Brennan, has helped us understand how to keep our students running smoothly as they grow into responsible adults." The applause from the audience of teachers, parents, and community members felt like recognition not just of our individual contributions, but of the journey we'd traveled together from crisis to redemption. Marcus looked at me from across the stage with a smile that contained no trace of embarrassment, only gratitude and pride in what we'd accomplished together. After the ceremony, we drove to our favorite coffee shop for our weekly conversation, a tradition that had developed over the years as our relationship had deepened and matured. The topics ranged from his latest research projects to my retirement plans, from current events to memories from his childhood that we were both finally able to discuss without pain or regret. "You know what I realized today?" Marcus said as we settled into our usual corner table. "If someone had told me 15 years ago that I'd be working at the same elementary school where my father was the maintenance supervisor, I would have been horrified. It would have felt like proof that I'd failed to achieve anything meaningful with my education and opportunities." He paused to sip his coffee, looking around at the familiar cafe where we'd shared so many important conversations over the years. "But now, working at Lincoln Elementary feels like the greatest honor of my professional life. Not because of what it says about my career success, but because of what it represents about our relationship and my commitment to the values you taught me. The embarrassment I used to feel about your work has been replaced by pride in following your example of service to the community." His words captured the complete transformation of perspective that had occurred through his years of accountability and growth. The son who'd once seen my working-class background as a liability now viewed it as a model of integrity and contribution that he wanted to emulate in his own professional life. As we finished our coffee and prepared to head home, Marcus pulled out his phone to show me photos from a recent conference where he'd presented his latest research findings. The images showed him speaking to auditoriums full of academics, policymakers, and practitioners, sharing insights that had grown from his personal experience with crime and redemption. "These people hang on every word because they know I'm not just reporting research findings," he said. "I'm sharing lessons learned through devastating mistakes and hard-won recovery. My criminal history, which used to be a source of shame, has become the foundation for work that's actually changing lives and policies. The drive home took us through downtown Portland, past the law office where Marcus had once worked before his arrest, past the federal courthouse where he'd been sentenced to 8 years in prison, past the halfway house where he'd begun his reintegration into society. Each landmark represented a different phase of his journey, from privileged young lawyer to convicted felon to respected researcher and youth advocate. "Sometimes I think about alternate timelines," Marcus said as we passed the federal courthouse. "What if you had written that character reference letter? What if I'd received a lighter sentence and gotten out of prison after 2 or 3 years instead of 6? Would I have learned the same lessons? Would I have developed the same commitment to helping others?" His question touched on the central mystery of transformation and redemption. How much suffering was necessary for genuine change? How much accountability was required for lasting growth? The answers were unknowable, but Marcus's experience suggested that facing full consequences had been crucial for his development into someone who could contribute meaningfully to preventing similar tragedies. "I don't think you would have learned the same lessons with a shorter sentence," I said honestly. "The time in prison wasn't just punishment, it was opportunity for reflection and growth that you wouldn't have had in your comfortable professional life. The complete disruption of your old identity forced you to discover who you really wanted to be." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, acknowledging the paradox that his greatest professional achievements had grown from his most devastating personal failures. The criminal conviction that had ended his legal career had ultimately led to work that was more meaningful and impactful than anything he might have accomplished as a corporate lawyer. We pulled into my apartment complex as the sun was setting over Portland's skyline, the same view I'd had throughout the years of Marcus's legal troubles, incarceration, and recovery. The familiar surroundings reminded me of all the difficult conversations we'd had in my kitchen, all the sleepless nights I'd spent worrying about his future, all the gradual progress that had slowly rebuilt our relationship and his character. "Thank you," Marcus said as we sat in the parked car for a moment before heading inside. "Not just for tonight, but for everything. For refusing to enable my worst impulses, for maintaining boundaries when I needed accountability, for being patient during my transformation, and for welcoming me back into your life when I finally became someone worth knowing." His gratitude felt genuine and well-earned. The journey from his arrest to his current success had taken 15 years of consistent effort, accountability, and growth. The relationship between us had been rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect rather than obligation, shared values rather than family duty, and authentic affection rather than social expectations. Standing in my kitchen later that evening, I looked at the collection of photos and awards that decorated my refrigerator. Pictures of Marcus receiving his doctoral degree, newspaper clippings about his research and community work, thank you notes from students and families who'd benefited from his mentorship programs.
Each item represented a different aspect of his transformation from someone I'd been reluctant to provide character references for into someone whose character spoke for itself through consistent actions over many years. The phone rang as I was preparing for bed, displaying Marcus's number on the caller ID. He called most evenings to check in and share updates about his work, a habit that had developed during his early recovery and continued even after he'd established complete independence and stability. "I forgot to mention earlier," he said when I answered, "Dr. Chan called today about a new research opportunity. The federal government is funding a comprehensive study of intervention strategies for white-collar crime prevention, and they want me to lead the project. It would be a 3-year commitment with a significant budget for community partnerships and pilot programs." The opportunity represented another step forward in Marcus's professional development, but I was most struck by his tone as he described it. There was excitement about the potential impact of the research, but no trace of the status-seeking ambition that had characterized his earlier career. He was evaluating the opportunity based on its potential to contribute to crime prevention and victim protection, rather than its implications for his professional reputation or financial advancement. "It sounds like meaningful work," I said. "Are you interested in taking it on?" "I think so," he replied. "The research could help develop evidence-based approaches to preventing the kinds of mistakes I made." If we can understand what drives good people to make destructive choices, maybe we can design interventions that address those underlying factors before crimes occur. His vision for using research to prevent crime rather than just respond to it represented the ultimate expression of his transformation. Marcus had moved beyond personal redemption to systemic contribution. Using his experience with both perpetrating and recovering from white-collar crime to develop solutions that might protect future victims and prevent future offenders. After ending the call, I sat in my living room thinking about the remarkable journey that had brought Marcus from federal prison to leading national research initiatives. The character references that had seemed so crucial during his legal proceedings had ultimately been provided by his own actions over many years of consistent positive choices. The reputation he'd been so desperate to protect through my testimony had been rebuilt through authentic service to his community. The story felt complete but ongoing. Marcus would continue growing and contributing, facing new challenges and opportunities as his career developed. Our relationship would continue evolving as we both aged and learned from our experiences. But the foundation had been established for a future based on shared values, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other and for the community we both served. The next morning brought news that provided a perfect capstone to Marcus's transformation story. The Portland Tribune was planning a feature article about local success stories in criminal justice reform, and they wanted to interview both Marcus and me about our experience with accountability, redemption, and family healing. We're particularly interested in your perspective as a father who refused to provide character references during your son's legal proceedings, the reporter explained during our initial conversation. That decision was controversial at the time, but it appears to have contributed to his successful rehabilitation and current contributions to crime prevention. The interview process was extensive, involving separate conversations with Marcus and me, discussions with his colleagues and the young people he'd mentored, and review of his research and policy work. The reporter was thorough in documenting both the painful aspects of his criminal behavior and the authentic nature of his subsequent transformation. The resulting article, published on the front page of the Sunday edition, was titled "From Federal Prison to Policy Leadership: A Portland Father and Son's Journey Through Crime and Redemption." It featured photographs of Marcus working with students at Lincoln Elementary, presenting research at academic conferences, and meeting with state legislators about criminal justice reform. But the image that meant the most to me was the final photograph in the article. Marcus and me standing together outside Lincoln Elementary, both smiling genuinely as we discussed his latest prevention research. The caption read, "Dr. Marcus Brennan and his father Theo Brennan have found that authentic accountability and family support can transform even devastating mistakes into opportunities for meaningful contribution." Reading our story in print, seeing it presented as an example of successful criminal justice reform and family healing felt like official recognition that the journey was complete. Marcus had not only overcome his criminal past, he'd transformed it into a platform for preventing similar tragedies and supporting other families facing similar challenges. The article generated responses from around the country, including letters from other families dealing with criminal justice issues, invitations for Marcus to speak at conferences and universities, and inquiries from researchers interested in collaborating on crime prevention projects. His story had become a resource for others navigating the complex terrain of accountability, redemption, and family relationships. 6 months after the newspaper article was published, Marcus called with news that brought his transformation full circle. He'd been invited to serve on a federal advisory committee examining character reference practices in criminal sentencing, providing input on how to balance accountability with rehabilitation in federal court proceedings. They want my perspective as someone who experienced both the consequences of not receiving character reference support and the benefits of facing full accountability, he explained. The goal is to develop guidelines that promote genuine rehabilitation rather than just sentence mitigation. His appointment to the Federal Advisory Committee represented the ultimate vindication of our decision to prioritize accountability over enablement during his legal proceedings. The choice that had seemed harsh and unforgiving at the time had ultimately positioned Marcus to contribute to policy discussions about how to make the criminal justice system more effective at promoting positive change. Standing in my kitchen on a quiet Tuesday evening, reflecting on the call about Marcus's federal appointment, I thought about the remarkable arc of his life over the past 16 years. From someone whose character was so questionable that I couldn't honestly recommend him to the courts, to someone whose character was so well established that the federal government sought his input on criminal justice policy. The transformation had been neither quick nor easy. It had required years of accountability, growth, and consistent positive choices. But the outcome has exceeded anything I dared to hope for during the darkest days of his legal troubles. Marcus had not only redeemed himself, he'd become a force for preventing others from making similar mistakes and helping the criminal justice system better serve both victims and offenders. The evening light was fading over Portland as I finished reviewing the day's mail, which included another thank you note from a family whose teenager had benefited from Marcus's mentorship programs. These notes arrived regularly, testimonials to the positive impact of his work and evidence of the authentic transformation that had occurred through his commitment to service and accountability. Outside my kitchen window, children were playing in the apartment complex courtyard, their laughter carrying the same joy and innocence I heard every day at Lincoln Elementary. Their carefree activity reminded me of the hundreds of young people whose lives had been positively influenced by Marcus's prevention work, kids who would now be less likely to make the kinds of destructive choices that had once derailed his promising future. The story that had begun with such devastation and disappointment had ultimately become a testament to the possibility of genuine redemption through accountability, service, and authentic relationship. Marcus had proven that even the most serious mistakes could be transformed into opportunities for meaningful contribution. And our relationship had demonstrated that love sometimes required the courage to allow people to face difficult consequences rather than enabling them to avoid accountability. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.